Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends. I'm here again with my friend Ty Esslinger, and we are continuing our Bible study in 1 Corinthians in chapter 7 today. And this, I hope, will have a great amount of information for us, and we'll be able to take some of this to heart and go from there. I want to be careful not to read too much into this and bring too much culture into this. I want to read what it actually says, and we'll try to interpret and apply that to our lives today based upon the scriptural interpretation. So we want to do that. Appreciate you guys sitting in on our Bible study. Be sure to subscribe and like. That helps us with YouTube. Once you subscribe, if you hit the little bell icon, you'll get an email every time we post this. Going along. How you doing, Ty?
I'm doing well.
Now, this is a famous chapter in 1 Corinthians. It is the chapter on sex and marriage. I've got that heading right there, okay? And we want to take a look at this. Paul is, again, he's writing this to a troubled church. And they're having all kinds of difficulties in this church. Difficulties with doctrine, difficulties with sin and illicit sex and any number of things. And we've already addressed that in the first 6 chapters. And now we're going into a new section. And this is part 3 that goes all the way from chapter 7 all the way to chapter 16. And it's basically Paul answering questions that they've asked. Now, this is one of the reasons why scholars believe that there is a 1 Corinthians part A that we don't have, because he's making it very clear here. He says, look, concerning the matters about which you wrote. So it's obvious he has received a letter from them before. Mm-hmm. And it's fairly clear from the text that he has written them before. They have written him back with questions, and now he is answering those questions in 1 Corinthians. So basically, God did not want those early documents to be in the canon, or they would be. He's totally capable of protecting those and bringing those to the canon, so we would have had them. But what we have here is the inspired response to those first letters, okay? Mm-hmm. So he's basically going to go into the matters, and this starts out, this whole section from chapter 7 all the way down to chapter 16, concerning the matters about which you wrote, okay? Now, the first one is, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Now, that's a broad principle that sexual relations is having sex outside of the context of marriage. Now, he's already addressed that earlier in the book, where he's talking about temple prostitutes. He's talking about casual sex here. And it's basically, he's saying it's good not to go around just having sex. And that's a good principle for us today. So the first section, we're talking from verse 1, if you look at this bar, from verse 1 down to verse 9 is basically general principles of married life. And the first principle is, it's not good to sleep around. All right?
You know, if somebody had advice for marriage and that was the one that they led with, like, yeah.
And now we're going to apply that, and he's going to apply that to marriage here in a second, because he says it's a good principle not to sleep around. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. So he's not saying, as a general principle, man should never have sex with a woman. He's basically saying man should never have sex with a woman outside of the context of a sanctioned marriage. Mm-hmm. He says, but because of sexual temptation, that is, man, if you, and he's gonna say this again in a minute, if you just have a real problem with temptations, it's good to be married, because that gives you a permanent sex partner to share sex with. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
These are general principles of marriage. It says because of sexual temptation, it's good to have a wife, or it's good to have a husband, because that's one of the roles that a husband and a wife fulfills in the other person, is fulfilling this area of sex, and he's going to get more into that. He says the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. Now, it's important here that we see that it isn't just, and this is kind of a modern thing, I run into men all the time that say, sex is all about what I want. Have you ever run into that, Ty?
I haven't had anyone say it.
When I come home and I want to have sex, we have sex because it's about what I need. It's about what I want. It's about my desires, right? And one of the things, even in the church, one of the areas of counseling that we run into a lot is rape within the context of marriage. And by that, I'm talking about forced sex.
Yeah.
Where the man says, I want sex, and the woman goes, well, I don't feel like it, or I don't want it at this point, or whatever the reasons. And the man forces himself upon her because under this guise of, I'm the man and I have rights and you can't deny me. And that's a shame. Because look at this verse. This verse says, a husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. Now, conjugal rights conjugal means sexual rights. But sexual rights might also mean sexual rights at the correct time, right? It doesn't mean forcing her. It means she has sexual rights. And men should not think that a woman is just a sex slave for whenever I feel like it, no matter what she wants. And I don't have to worry about foreplay or any of this nonsense. I just want to have sex. I want to have sex. This is going to be an adult theme, by the way. This is an adult theme Bible study. But you see what I mean?
Yeah.
The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. And likewise, the husband or the wife should give conjugal rights to the husband. Now that basically means the wife should not say, there's no way I'm going to have sex with you. And if they're in a situation where either one is saying, I refuse to have sex with him, that's a need for counseling. That's for spiritual counseling. Because both the husband and wife have sexual rights within the context of marriage. Now, not outside of that. A man should not say to a girl, hey, if you love me, you need to put out.
Yeah.
That's not what it's talking about here.
That's a big no.
Yeah, that's exactly. We have to get this context, because the culture, our culture today, like the culture in Corinth, the culture is a culture of very free sex, very free attitudes about sex. And they've written him and asked him some questions about sexual relations, about temple prostitutes, and about sex outside of marriage. And he's trying to give them some solid biblical principles that we can relate to and we can apply in our lives. So it's important that husbands need to know the wives have rights, and husbands and wives need to know the husbands have rights. And marriage is an accommodation. It's an accommodation of the other person's rights.
I've never heard personally of a situation where somebody used these verses as an excuse for forcing sex, but I can see how. Well,
I've run into it in cases of outside of marriage, guys that are looking for sex don't use the Bible very often. They just say, "I want to have sex, and if you love me, you'll have sex with me." And they pressure the woman in this. But this is the context of the marriage relationship, and I have had cases of having to counsel about marriage rape.
It cannot be easy.
It is an issue, and it's not an easy issue, but it is an issue where usually it is the women who are being sexually abused by their Christian husbands.
Yeah.
And we got to go to this text, and we have to take them to this text and say, look, hey, this is not all about you and what you want. This is, the wife has some rights too. And to the wife, you can't just cut the husband off. That is not a biblical principle either.
Yeah. So there's not a lot of Christians at my workplace, and I spend a lot of time at my work, right? So I talk to these guys a lot, and most of them are married, and so I get to hear a lot about their marriages. And wow, it sounds rough.
Yeah.
And like sex is used as a bargaining chip in arguments, or if at all.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And sex is in the culture. Sex is that leverage we use on each other, and wives use it against husbands. Husbands use it against wives, and in the culture, it's I'm married. Well, are you happily married? Because being married doesn't matter anymore. He is talking to the church here. This is to the church in Corinth.
Yeah.
And he's talking about Christian principles, biblical principles of marriage. If you're saying you're a Christian, these are principles that need to apply to your relationships. And he's going to talk more about singles, and he's going to talk more about marrieds. So let's keep going. It says, the wife does not have authority over her body. Now, I've had husbands say, look, I have authority over her body. And they love that part of that verse, but they don't read the rest of it. Read the rest of it.
Yeah. It has the second half.
Yeah. And men, Christian men, we need to understand this. We need to continue to date our wives. We need to continue to woo our wives. It's not just about, hey, I got my rights. That's it. She has her rights too. And the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So this is a mutual authority. It's a mutual conjugal appreciation. And it says now, and then he gives a command. Do not deprive one another of that. In other words, my wife has needs. I don't want to deprive her of those needs. And if her needs might be, I just want to cuddle. I may not want to have sex, but I just want to cuddle. That's a need. I need to respond to that need. So he says, don't deprive one another in the context of each other's bodies, okay? Don't deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time. So let's say we're going to go to a conference, and we really want to fast and pray, and we want to focus on the Lord. So we're not going to have sex during this period of time, an agreed upon period of time. Great. But he says, otherwise, don't arbitrarily deprive each other. That's not healthy in the marriage relationship. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, that's fairly clear. He says, by agreement, that you might devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. In other words, this goes especially to us men because we are notoriously lacking in self-control. And the wife needs to appreciate that she is ministering to the husband in the area of his self-control by keeping him sexually satisfied. That's part of her helping her helpmate in this area. So he says, don't deprive each other. Work together. And that's in the Song of Solomon. It talks about chapter 5, verse 1 through 6. It talks about meeting each other's needs in the area of sex. It's a great Bible study to do together, for that matter. So we go, it's not about the man's rights, and it's not about the woman's rights. It's about a mutual understanding and a mutual cooperation in the area of sex. He's being very straightforward here. Now, he says, as a concession, not a command. Now, this is interesting because a number of times in this book, he's going to say, now, this is my opinion. Now, he's being humble here, giving counsel, but he's giving counsel under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and he's writing this down under inspiration. So even when he says, now, this is not a command, it's just my idea. This is not from the Lord, it's just my idea. This is being inspired by God. This is in the text. This doesn't give us the excuse to say, oh, well, he says this is just his opinion. If it's in the scriptures, God has inspired it to be in the scriptures. So we need to not dismiss this. But he says, and now as a concession, I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God. Now I want to explain that a little bit. He is, at this moment, single. Mm-hmm. Now there are a lot of scholars, Jewish believing scholars, and a lot of scholars that believe that Paul was divorced. Because before he becomes a Christian, he is a Pharisee. And one of the requirements of a Pharisee, even a young Pharisee like he was, one of the requirements of a Pharisee is to be married to a proper Jewish wife. Now, one of the reasons that Paul can go into such detail about divorce, especially divorce with an unbelieving spouse, is because many scholars believe that he was married, and when he became a Christian and began being a Christ follower, the proper Jewish wife left him and divorced him. And so a lot of people think that he is single, but he is single as a divorcee.
Yeah.
In fact, in one place he says, how come it's only Timothy and I that don't get a believing wife? And that word believing is very important there. He doesn't say, how come we don't get a wife?
Yeah.
He says, how come we don't get a believing wife? So a lot of scholars think that he was divorced because it was the only way he could have been a Pharisee before he was a Christian.
Okay.
But he says here in verse 7, I wish that all of you were like I am. I am now. But each has his own gift from God. Now that's important because each has his own gift, meaning a wife is a gift. Being married is a gift. But also being single is a gift. Right?
Doesn't feel like that to most.
Well, yeah, it takes a certain amount of understanding. And he is going to relate to that. If you flip all the way over to verse 30, 32, and 33, he says in the same chapter, he says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. Now, if he's married, that's okay to have, he needs to have interest in his wife.
Hmm.
But if you're single, you better understand that if you get married, part of being married is being interested in the interests of the wife's needs. So if you're single and you want to serve the Lord and you want to follow him directly, don't be looking to be married unless it becomes very obvious this is the leading of the Lord. All right?
Hmm.
Now we're going to get into that. We're going to cover that in more detail. But right now, I wanted to finish this section. He says, I wish all of you were as I myself am, single. But each of you has his own gift from God. Now that means being married is a gift, just as being single is a gift.
Hmm.
Because both of them get to be a gift from God to have different focuses in the life of the married person or the life of the single person. So if all of a sudden you're single and all of a sudden, I was just watching a YouTube video on a couple of gals. It's called Coffee. I think it's called Coffee Time with God or something like that. It's great. And they're single girls. And they were talking about how important it is to be single and appreciate being single, because that means you can single-mindedly follow the Lord and grow in him. And now if you come to a point where he brings somebody into your life and that develops into a marriage, that's okay. But it's not for you to seek after and crave, right?
Yeah.
Consider it a gift if you're single, and consider it a gift if you're married. He says, one of one kind and one of another. In other words, he's made it clear. He says, it'd be nice if you were single, but everybody's got a gift. And if you're married, that's a gift. And if you're single, that's a gift. And each of you needs to appreciate your status as a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And then more explanation. To the unmarried and to the widows, I say it is good for them to remain single, as I am. Now, it's interesting, in 1 Timothy, he talks about widows. And he says to widows there, it is good for a widow to remarry if she's a young widow. But if you are a widow, and he calls it this in 1 Timothy, if you are a widow indeed, that is, if you are an older woman who's been widowed, don't be trying to get remarried. Minister as a mature Christian woman. Mm-hmm. That's in 1 Timothy. So I have to take that as a cross-reference here and say, to the unmarried and to widows who are not marriable, don't crave to be married. Remain unmarried. It's perfectly fine to remain single. Now that helps people, because I've been in churches where the pastor was kind of a marrying guy, and he didn't like people being single, and he was constantly trying to be a matchmaker. And that's all well and good, but sometimes he married some young people that really shouldn't have been married, and ended up getting divorced later because they were kind of rushed into it. You know what I'm saying? So it's, as a spiritual leader, I need to look at a single person, and if that single person is single-mindedly following the Lord, I shouldn't be worrying about them getting married. Now, if they come to me and they're saying, boy, I'm having trouble with this idea of marriage, and I really want to be married, then I need to counsel them about how to find a mature Christian partner. And Paul is going to go there. And that's what his next thing, this next section from verse 10 to verse 13, which we're going to cover next week. And we're going to verse 14. Next week, he's going to talk about, these have been principles, general principles of marriage. Okay? And now he's going to talk about principles of married Christians. All right? So he's going to talk about that starting at verse 10. Let's pick that up next week. Is that all right with you?
Yeah.
All right. So let's do that. And read 10 to 13 specifically from the idea of the principles of married Christians. And then he starts talking about from 14 to 16, he talks about for non-Christian initiators of divorce, the principles there, because there are in the case of marriage, there may be a non-Christian who initiates divorce. And there's some principles for Christians there. And then he's going to talk about the principles of abiding in God's will. Okay? And we're going to talk about that probably starting next week. So we'll go from verse 10 probably into verse 18, 19 next week.
Okay.
Give me a reaction. What have you learned anything today? Was anything new, or is this pretty much where you were at?
For the most part, it's pretty much where I was at. I guess it hasn't been my experience for people to use certain sections in this as an excuse, but I definitely see how, especially since we as human beings can justify about anything that we want to justify.
Yeah.
Right.
That's that verse that talks about there was a way that is right in the eyes of we can talk ourselves into anything.
Oh yeah. So it's important to make sure that you got a good grasp of the context.
Yeah, and where I have found, I've been married 46 years, and where I have found this area to really apply is when we're not getting along, when there's some kind of a fight, when there's some kind of a disagreement. We both have to be careful, and we've talked about this when we weren't fighting, so that we've got this base that when we're fighting, we do not want to use that area of sex as a weapon.
Weapon or leverage.
Yeah. If we've talked about that when we weren't fighting, then when we start to have a disagreement and all of a sudden it's,
yeah,
I'm cutting you off. We can say, well, wait a minute. We talked about this. I understand that you're not in a great sexual mood at the moment, and I understand that. And that goes into your need. So if you need to go in the other room and be by yourself for a little while, fine. But I want to come in, and I'm just going to put my arms around you and say I'm sorry, and I'm going to make up to you. And that doesn't necessarily mean leading to sex. It just means we're not going to have that sexual weapon wielded.
Right.
And that's important. That's important.
I am so thankful for these principles of marriage, because I look at my coworkers and how their marriages are, and these principles were set in place for both of our benefit.
That's right. And
I'm so
literally,
happy that they're here.
I mean, literally, Paul is writing it to Christians in the church to equip them to live in this culture that is so anti-marriage and anti-good relationship and anti-health, really sexual health, that is one of the motivations where he's answering. And obviously that's on their mind because they asked about it. So we're dealing with a real issue of marital counseling here, and Paul has given us some great benefits, great counseling that will help our relationships in marriage, even in troubled marriages. And we're going to talk more about that as the section goes along. So we're not going to rush through this. We want to deal with this in a way that is edifying, in a way that helps you. And you on YouTube, hope you've been blessed by this. I'd love to hear your comments, and I'll try to reply to those comments as quickly as possible. So I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this, if this was a blessing to you, please like it and subscribe. Hit the little bell icon so that I email you every time, or that YouTube emails you every time we do this. And we're going to end right here and say, God bless you. Read ahead. Read and pray through verse 10 through about 16 for sure. And we'll see where God takes us in our discussion. All right with you, Ty?
Sounds good, man.
Sounds good. God bless you guys. We'll see you next week.